Hi, I'm Mayor Marty Walsh, and I want to thank Toy Burton and DeeDee's Cry for the incredible work they do in the Boston community all year long. And I want to thank all of them for organizing this event today. Mental health is just as important as physical health, and seeking and accepting help is a sign of strength. That's especially true right now. The pandemic has added a whole new set of challenges to everyday life. For people who were struggling before, it can even be harder to manage this added weight. I'm here to tell you it's okay to feel fear and anxiety. We'll feel that for some time. This is an important time to take care of yourself. We're all handling this the best we can. And the only thing we can do is take one day at a time. If you need someone to talk to, you have options. You can call your healthcare provider to get set up with a telehealth counselor. Or you can call 311 at the city, our hotline, to get connected to anonymous counseling over the phone. I know that DeeDee's Cry is going to share some important resources with you today. I want to thank the panelists for coming together and sharing their stories. In times like these, it's important to support one another and find ways to connect. I wish you all the very best, and I thank you for creating a positive change in our community.
Thank you, Mayor Marty Walsh. Hello, everyone in Facebook Live. This is Robin Saunders, your host tonight. And I want to welcome you to DeeDee's Cry as they present Roxbury Lost. Before we jump right in, let's give thanks to our sponsors for the evening. I want to thank you to Callaway Graphics for the flyer. Also the Louis D. Brown Peace Institute for always supporting DeeDee's Cry. Java with Jimmy. We have Jimmy Hills in the background, or in the forefront actually, with us tonight. And also the Roxbury Unity Parade for hosting this discussion. Right now, I want to turn the mic over to Toy Burton. She's going to explain to you how tonight's event was brought up. She's going to explain how we chose this theme, introduce herself, DeeDee's Cry, and then bring the mic back to me. Toy?
Thank you so much, Robin. Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Toy Burton, and I am the founder and executive director of DeeDee's Cry, Suicide Prevention and Family Support, and I'm also the founder and executive director of the Roxbury Unity Parade. So Roxbury is a neighborhood in Boston. Well, first, let me talk about how I started DeeDee's Cry. So DeeDee's Cry is named after my sister who died by suicide at the age of 23 back in 1986. So I started DeeDee's Cry in 2017 when I noticed that organizations that focus on mental health and suicide prevention didn't have the events or their outreach in the Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan areas, neighborhoods of color of Boston. So I started DeeDee's Cry to make it accessible. So that's why DeeDee's Cry's events will always be free. But you can, if you support what we're doing, please make a donation, write Louis D. Brown Peace Institute, they're our fiscal sponsor, and mail it to DeeDee's Cry, 2 John Elliott Square, 2C. So with that being said, last week in our neighborhood, a mural came down called Roxbury Love. And what I saw on social media is that people were angry and people were hurt, and people just felt like Roxbury's becoming unrecognizable. So that's where I came up with the name Roxbury Lost. So this event is not about the mural, it's about the change that is happening around us and how it affects us. So that's what this conversation is about. And thank you to the panelists for being here. Oh, and I also want to say something else. In haste, we're getting the flyer out because this was so spur of the moment. I want to recognize Dr. Brandy Brooks, because on the flyer, I put Roxbury resident, but she is more than that. She is also the Director of Operations for the Roxbury Unity Parade and for DeeDee's Cry. So she brings a lot to the table, and also a Roxbury resident. So I just want to acknowledge Brandy and apologize for that. But yeah, that won't happen again. So thank you, everyone. Robin?
Thank you, Toy. So yes, Roxbury Love, Roxbury Lost. Roxbury. Before we hand the mic over and introduce our guest, our family here tonight, let's just think about Roxbury, because depending on your age and where you grew up or where you went to school or where you work or worked or went to school, past or present tense, depending on your age, it means different things to different people. At one point, for instance, the South End, what is known as the South End, was known as Roxbury. Now it's known as the South End. And so depending on how old you are, you might know it as Roxbury or you might not. Franklin Park also at one point was all Roxbury. Now it's part of JP, part of Roxbury, part of Dorchester, part of Mattapan. So all of this to say we are all in a transition of, I guess it's gentrification. And it's something that happens with a passage of time. It's something that you just can't point your finger at. It's not at one point in time that it happened. It's a slow and moving process. And as with everything with time, that all affects lives and human beings. And that affects us physically, mentally, spiritually. And again, we got to mentally. So that all has to do with our mental well-being and our mental health. So we're going to tie the thought of Roxbury Love, which was the mural, but also Roxbury Lost, into how that affects us as residents of this city, as families in this city, as elders and youth, students, employees of the city of Boston within Roxbury. So right about now, I'd like to introduce our family of guests tonight. I'm going to give you all maybe 30 seconds to quickly introduce yourself and your ties to Roxbury. And just a quick introduction, because I want to have more time with our moderator and also our host as they ask you more questions. So let's start off with, first of all, Liz Miranda, our representative. Could you give us a brief introduction and how you're connected to Roxbury?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you. It's quite a privilege to be on this panel with all of you. I'm Liz Miranda, State Rep of the 5th Suffolk District, which includes parts of Roxbury and Dorchester, but I'm a lifelong Roxbury girl until I moved to Grove Hall and then realized that that had changed to Dorchester. But I have exclusively had a love relationship with this community that's led me to go to schools in this community, to work in this community, to live in this community, even serve on the Roxbury Historical Society for many years as the youngest board member for my love of the history of Roxbury from colonial times and indigenous times to today. And I am really showing up in this space because I grew up in the Dudley Triangle. And I know a lot about when you talk about Roxbury Love and Roxbury Lost, around that transformation of that part of Roxbury.
Thank you. Now let's have Byron Rushing introduce himself and give us your connection with Roxbury, please.
It is so good to be with you. And Toy, I want to thank you so much for gathering us together for this important topic. I want to introduce myself by saying that I have been working in Roxbury since 1964. I have had really sort of 3 careers. One as a community organizer, which is how I began working in Roxbury, doing most of my work at that time in Lower Roxbury, but other parts of Roxbury at the same time. And then I moved on to help to organize the Museum of Afro-American History and worked at the Museum of Afro-American History for about 10 or 11 years. And then after that job, I took on probably the job that I got paid for the longest in my life, was to be state representative in the Massachusetts legislature, where I represented most of the South End and then parts of the Fenway and parts of Roxbury. And I am now retired, though I see my work as a community organizer as the work that defines my whole career, both on the streets, at the Museum of Afro-American History, and in the State House.
Thank you so much. And now could we have Marisa Luse please introduce yourself and how you're connected to Roxbury?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Marisa Luse, and I'm very excited to be on this panel with all of you and all of you who have such deep love for Roxbury. And so I'm a lifelong resident of Roxbury. I have deep roots. I grew up in, I always am hesitant to say this, but it's the lower part of Roxbury, but it just gives you my geography. And I've been active in the community since I was 13, 14 years old, being civically engaged. And I feel like that's where my community organizing roots began. And since then, I just feel like I live, work, and play in Roxbury. And so I was educated in Roxbury from going to schools and participating in the Boston Public School system, of course, as well as going to college. I went to Northeastern University, literally across the street from my house. And I also work in Roxbury and at Northeastern University. And I'm also very involved in on a number of different Roxbury boards. I would also say, just like State Rep Miranda, one of the youngest members of the Roxbury Historical Society. And I also serve on the Roxbury Montessori School, which I hope will be opening soon in Roxbury. And I also serve on the Roxbury Strategic Master Plan Oversight Committee with the City of Boston.
Thank you very much. And now, Toy, just briefly, what's your connection to Roxbury?
Again, everyone, my name is Toy Burton, and I am a Roxbury native. I grew up in Roxbury. My mom grew up in Roxbury, Rubber Street Projects. And even though when I was young, I moved to Dorchester to be with my mom and eventually moved back to Roxbury, I always say I'm a Roxbury girl. So I feel you on that one, Liz, forever Roxbury. In 2017, I felt like I was volunteering in the Dorchester Day Parade. And I was like, wait a minute, how come Roxbury doesn't have a parade? I was like, we are a proud people. Roxbury needs to be celebrated. And out of my love for Roxbury, I started the Roxbury Unity Parade.
Wonderful, very good. And now, Dr. Brandy Brooks, please introduce yourself and your connection to Roxbury.
Hey everyone, unlike the other panelists, I think I've been in Roxbury the shortest amount of time. I'm originally from the South, but I moved to Boston in 2003 to go to school, and I haven't left. I've been a resident of Roxbury in particular since 2007. And like everyone else on the panel has spoken to, I have a love of Roxbury. You know, I've volunteered, I've worked in Roxbury, and now with Toy serving on the Roxbury Unity Parade and DeeDee's Cry. And so I'm very excited to be part of this conversation, and I look forward to it.
And actually, Dr. Brandy, you could continue on with giving us an intro into tonight's discussion, and then turn it over to Jimmy, please, as the moderator.
Oh, okay, sure. So I think one of the things I heard when Robin was introducing, and Toy when she was talking about why she wanted to have this conversation, it was really around the changes we are seeing in Roxbury, and how we are dealing with those changes, how we are coping with some of those changes, and what we're going to do about those changes. And so kind of in thinking about how to structure this intro of sorts, I really was thinking about that word change, and the fact that change is unavoidable in our lives. We grow older, even if we, all of us in this panel stay young at heart. We move, we may lose loved ones, we may change jobs. Any life is a life full of change, right? But some of those changes are unexpected. And some changes are ones that we knew were coming, but even when they happen, it still has an impact. And so regardless of how the change happen, it impacts our finances in some respect. Some changes impacts our spiritual connections. Some changes impact our physical health, and some impact our mental health. In the wake of the removal of Roxbury Love mural, I've seen, like Toy mentioned earlier, different reactions to this change that occurred. On one side of the spectrum, on social media, I saw people that were really angry, frustrated, and saddened, not necessarily by the removal of the mural, but more so by the overwhelming outpouring for something they see as an inanimate object. You know, some of the comments along this thread went something like, well, where was your anger, frustration, or sadness when the meetings were being held back in 2016? You know, or some of the comments went like, well, I hope you're just as angry, sad, frustrated, and want to protest about some of the legislation that's currently being debated, you know, at the State House. And then some comments went even further to say, I don't even understand why the community of Roxbury is mad, because if you aren't the property owner, what are you mad about? It's not your property. Therefore, your anger is a little bit misplaced, because the property owners have the right to do whatever they want to their property, right? And you know, you just should have attended the meetings and discussions around that particular property. On the other end of the spectrum, on social media, I've seen comments related to the change that, again, still mirror frustration, sadness, anger about the removal of the mural. However, the comments differ slightly. The comments really take on kind of a macro and a micro level in terms of their overall feelings around how communities of color see this mural being removed as just another example of the marginalization which happens in our communities. It's another example of our voices not being heard. And so some of those comments highlighted, you know, the instances of the research behind the school to prison pipeline, you know, communities of colors being food deserts and not having access to real sustainable foods in their communities. You know, they highlighted things like, you know, communities of color right now with the war on drugs are still being jailed instead of receiving treatment. And then, you know, right now, because we're in the middle of a pandemic, the fact that communities of color, African-American communities in particular, have greater incidence and impact with regards to the pandemic. And so in that respect, those comments, when it comes to the change, see it differently. But I think the thing that we're going to talk about tonight is that this change that is going on in Roxbury does bring about very real emotions, thoughts, and beliefs in terms of where you are situated and what you want to do about that change. And so individually and collectively, that's what we're going to talk about this evening in this forum, in this discussion. And around this topic, while the mural was kind of the flashpoint, it's really a bigger conversation about what do we do in our communities and how do we continue to support each other individually and collectively around these topics. And so, as I said before, I'm glad to be part of this panel. I'm glad to be part of this discussion. And now I'll turn it over to James so he can introduce himself, and then we get into questions and really hearing from the panelists.
Good evening, everyone. My name is James Hills, host of Java with Jimmy, and also the digital director for DeeDee's Cry. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. I was not asked, but I will volunteer and say that my connection to Roxbury began on September 8, 1971. My mother went to girls' high school, gave birth to me as a resident of 25 Greenville Street, which is next to what you all may now know as the Dearborn. It was girls' high school, then it was Roxbury High School, and I see Mr. Rushing nodding his head. My connection to Roxbury is Freddie Parker's. My connection to Roxbury is Robel's. My connection to Roxbury is Kim Cap's. My connection to Roxbury is Cornfields. My connection to Roxbury is Brown's Market. Grew up right up the street from Orchard Gardens. So Roxbury, born and raised, and then transitioned to JP. But I will say that in the context, and as it said, just this is not just about the mural. It was an action optic of everything that Dr. Brandy named. What I would like to say and highlight is Toy and I had an interesting experience during the Roxbury Parade. We were riding down Blue Hill Ave, Warren Street, and noticed the construction. And she said, I hope they're not tearing it down. Toy, that was on Saturday. I think within like the next week or so, the story broke. Go ahead and chime in, Toy.
The parade was on Sunday.
The Sunday, sorry.
Caribbean on Sunday, and then it went down, I believe, that following Thursday.
I think it was that same week. So Toy had named it, and here we are. So I just want to give some context around Roxbury before we have our panelists talk. And I am going to start with, I say Dr. Rushing, I am going to start with him, but Roxbury was dissolved as a municipality in one of the 23 official neighborhoods of Boston used by the city. And it's referred to as the heart of Black culture in Boston. Roxbury was one of the first towns founded by the Massachusetts Bay Colony. We're going to have a little history here, I'm sure, from Dr. Rushing in 1630 and became a city in 1846. There was some alluding to this, but let's just talk about the original Roxbury. Christian Science, Symphony, and also over by Northeastern University, Boston Latin School. So those were some areas that Roxbury engulfed. And let's not talk about what's now known as West Roxbury. Was, if Dr. Rushing, and this is a good time to have you start, at one point was maybe a part of Roxbury. So again, tonight, this is an open discussion about Roxbury love and Roxbury Lost. And we're going to talk about its past, its present, and its future, and how the change that Dr. Brandy referred to has an impact on our psyche, on our mind. Robin or someone referred to sort of the food desert piece and how the gentrification is impacting us as a Black people and people of color of Roxbury. So at this time, Dr. Rushing, if you could please give us, we have such a wealth of knowledge that I will, as moderator, chime in. I'm known for butting in if it goes too long, but we want to give everybody a chance to share past history, current history, things that are going on. So Dr. Rushing, if you could start us off and give us some sort of context and from your view, Roxbury.
Thank you very much. And again, Toy, this is just so brilliant to do this, bring this group together. When I want to make sure that we understand they're interrelated, but in many ways, they are two different discussions. There is the discussion about the mural itself. And when the mural was put up, it was put up understanding that it was going to be taken down. It was put up to be some temporary public art on a wall that would go away somehow, maybe move, but somehow it was going to go away when the project was finally developed. And what we are discussing, of course, is the reaction to that. But I want to say one thing about temporary art. I like temporary public art. And I think, though, we have learned a lot in this case about how careful we have to be when we do it. That we have to tell people from the beginning. Many of the people who were there at the beginning knew it was going to be temporary. But far more people saw it than were there at the beginning, and far more people fell in love with it who were not at the beginning. I don't say there's something wrong with the people not coming to the first meetings. I say we who endorse putting it up in temporary art should have been more sensitive through the whole process. And we should have kept reminding people every chance we had. And I've said this to the developer, I've said this to Mr. Cruz, when it was going to come down, We should have been sensitive to how much people loved it, and we should have had an event around that art before it came down. Now, there'll be a lot of more discussion among us about that. But now I'm going to move on to Roxbury, the objective definition of Roxbury. And as Jimmy said, Roxbury got its name from the English. And the English came here in 1630, and they settled a number of towns. All these English were mostly Puritans, and they settled a number of towns that included Boston, but was not exclusively Boston. And they settled about 7 or 9 towns around Boston. And one of those towns that they settled was Roxbury. They actually knew they were going to develop this land as the imperialists that they were in this way, that they were going to come and they were going to spread out. I always ask people, and this is a trick question, you know what ship did the Pilgrims come over on? What ship did the Pilgrims come over on?
We would say the Mayflower.
The Mayflower, exactly, and you're right. What ship did the Puritans come over on? And you might be able to name one, but they came over in 17 ships. Right? They came here to settle and to stay. Now that town of Roxbury survives during the colonies into the United States, becoming the United States. It becomes a town in the new Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and it stays an independent town until 1868. And at that time, a lot of the other towns were becoming part of Boston. There's a wonderful set of political stories about why that happened, but they had a vote and voted to become part of Boston. And that's called annexation. And Liz knows more about this than I do, and we'll say more about it. Excuse me. And as Jimmy said beforehand, even before that happened, Roxbury split. So in the 1840s, the town of Roxbury split, and 2/3 of it off to the west became West Roxbury as a separate town. And then eventually West Roxbury became part of Boston. Now, all of this is to say that there are political, objective boundaries of Roxbury. We have a map of Roxbury. We have a map of the town. It became a city. We have a map of what became part of Boston in 1868. And that is, when people say, where is Roxbury? That is Roxbury. And it includes lots of what we call separate neighborhoods now, but they were all part of Roxbury. Mission Hill, half of Jamaica Plain, right? All part of that Roxbury. And if you want to see the map, as soon as it's open, go to the Dillaway Thomas house and you can see the map. And it's interesting, all of the things that are in it. Now, Black people come here at the beginning of the 1900s. They come here just while World War I is going on. And they, of course, moved from their neighborhood. And their neighborhood was on Beacon Hill. And for 100 years, Black people lived most Black people in Boston lived on the north slope of Beacon Hill. That's why the African Meeting House is on the north slope of Beacon Hill. That's when you go on the Black Heritage Trail, you walk around Beacon Hill. And then they moved to Roxbury. And when they moved to Roxbury, they do not fill it all up. Roxbury is big, as we know. And they moved to a part of Roxbury that's closest to Boston. And
Dr. Rushing, if I could chime in, just because there is such a wealth, and I wouldn't mind having you back at some point, maybe, and really just talk Roxbury and its historical.
I'm going to end this right now because this name was mentioned.
Okay.
And then that is a part of Roxbury. We call Lower Roxbury. But years ago, I was interviewing one of the first people who moved into that neighborhood. And she said, We never called it Lower Roxbury. We just called it Roxbury.
Roxbury. It is always Roxbury. And in that context, and as I said before, I don't mean to interrupt folks, but there's such a wealth of knowledge. And I thank Dr. Rushing for giving us sort of a historical context of Roxbury. What I'd like to do is give it now to Representative Liz Miranda to sort of catch us up. Roxbury girl, born and raised, and has seen a lot of change. And then you and Marisa, if you could sort of give us sort of an overview of the transition from where he talked about Roxbury came from to where it is today. And let's start with the good, and let's maybe have some conversation about what we've talked about, the change that's going on in Roxbury. So Representative Miranda, if you could let us know, just from your perspective, a Roxbury girl, based on what he just said, bring us up to date sort of now. Marisa, you can chime in sort of after her as well. And then Dr. Brandy will talk to you about sort of the impact of everything that's come up, because hearing this history, there's a different level of pride. But then to compare what we're going to hear where we are now, we might need a couple of minutes from you, Dr. Brandy.
I mean, I'd love to start where Byron kind of was leading to, was that Roxbury essentially has had a very significant and old history that should be regarded. It was part of the Revolutionary War. It was one of the towns. It became a streetcar suburb. It is everything to do with sort of our city's history. Almost every immigrant group made Roxbury its home. You know, I'm very prideful of my community. And one of the ways that I became more prideful was that I had gone through all of my schooling, even the John D. O'Brien School of Math and Science, without learning about Boston's Black history. It wasn't until I took a class with Dr. Tony Vandermeer at UMass Boston, that he started to have me really look back at my life. And when I remembered that I was part of a program called My Town, and in My Town, I learned about Boston's Black history through learning about the South End, and learning about the jazz history and the Great Migration and the Pullman Porters. And that's why there's a statue of A. Philip Randolph in Back Bay Station. And we owe so much to A. Philip Randolph and really desegregating so many things, including the armed forces, including unionization of workers, and leading Martin Luther King and other freedom fighters to really have a march on Washington. A lot of people don't know that history. And so those two moments in my life taught me a lot of pride. It gave me more tools in my toolbox, because when people would be talking about my community, it was not in a positive light. I had a serious issue with growing up in the Dudley Triangle, because we were literally the dumping ground of the city. I mean, we had 1,400 parcels of vacant land. We had illegal trash transfer stations. When the Cape Verdeans came to Roxbury, even though they had a 200-year history with Massachusetts in the 1970s, we were coming because we just fought a war with Portugal, which was our colonizer. And when they came to Roxbury, it was because it was the only place, this little part of Roxbury, which basically had homes for very cheap, or no one wanted to live there. And so they made it their home, and they have significantly also contributed, along with Puerto Ricans and those from the Caribbean, and in conjunction with African Americans moving from the South, of really making the soul of not only Roxbury, but the soul of Boston. You know, Roxbury is the geographic center of our city. And I'll stop there with sort of the historical context of like growing up in this community, but saying that one of the reasons why change has been incredibly difficult, and I could speak only for myself, is I have had a lifetime of losing. You know, I've seen so many things come and go. One thing in particular, when I was in college, I did an art project on Dudley Square on how public art is more than just art. It tells stories, it shares activism, it helps mobilize people. And I have all these photos of all these murals in Nubian Square that I learned were part of some of them, the Roxbury, sort of arts, the Black arts movement that happened along in our community and in the whole country. And today there are none of those murals left. even in my community, which has more murals than any other community in the Fifth Suffolk, from Dudley Street down to Upham's Corner, and onto parts of Dorchester, and including Grove Hall, what we've noticed is many of those things are gone too. And when we are not informed or engaged or participants in our own history, which has been sort of our history, then that has been part of the reason why people have been in an uproar. You know, I don't believe, you know, Roxbury Love was also a powerful message. You know, when people hear Biggie Smalls talk about spread love, it's the Brooklyn way. For me, being a Roxbury girl, I know that Roxbury has always been full of light, full of fight, full of history. And when we see messages that are empowering, whether they're faces of freedom fighters and messages of love, or they're a Cape Verde mural that was taken down in my neighborhood that showed a folklore legend called Nyolobu using something that mixes corn, which reminded the Cape Verdean community of their own history and contributions in coming to a foreign land, it has been traumatic. And so I just want to share that part of the change in the mental health is the reason why I started Project Crenshaw, which I'll talk about a little later so Marisa can chat. But the idea is that we've always lost things and have not been able to replace them in telling our own story. And part of this sort of feeling has been that we are never informed in a timely manner or engaged in a participatory project so that we can inform where we'd like things to go, what we'd like to stay and remain, and the things that we'd like to grow, where else would we like to see them?
Representative, thank you so much. Marissa's going to chime in, but I just want to name something that you said that goes to what Toy, and one of the reasons why we here is you talked about your story and telling the story, and Dr. Rushing talked about sort of the Roxbury story. And Marisa, I hate that when we have a time factor, a couple of our folks do need to go. But Marisa, you have the kind of a level of responsibility to when Representative Miranda was talking about the traumatic experience, that you've been here a lifelong, like Representative Miranda as well, but you at the grassroots level, Representative Miranda is familiar with that, but now she's working at a different level, but still. But you, if you could speak to sort of where we are now, you and I know the spaces have talked about gentrification and whatnot, and then we'll talk to Dr. Brandy, because the site change that Representative Miranda started to talk about, you and I have had deeper conversations and you've seen it. So if you could sort of encapsulate sort of where we are now, it wasn't just the mural on Warren Street, but Representative Miranda talked about a level of losses and whatnot. So that's why even in this mental health space, we're going to go with Dr. Brandy.
So in terms of where we are now, is I think that we are all in a very confused and conflicted space. So for me, growing up in Roxbury, I grew up in a village. And so, however, the generations after us have not. And I can't even speak for everyone else, but I know that I grew up in a village. And I think that, and that's where I think it's really hard for when we're talking about engagement or the lack of engagement in our community. I think it's because there are so many residents in different spaces and that have different kinds of connections with Roxbury. So serving on the oversight committee and seeing the lack of participation in the room, in terms of development that is happening in our community. One, here is we could look at these development projects as opportunity, right? But honestly, it does bring us back to a sense of loss because we haven't felt that we've gained anything. You know, for 40 years of my life, or most of my life, like the Ferdinand building or even Dudley Square, which is now known as Nubian Square, was ignored. And now there's so much attention and so much interest. And when we do hear about what the developers want to build in our community, we realize that none of it identifies with us, those that are currently living here, right? Families can't live in a studio. Families cannot families need spaces to park their vehicles, right? Like, so everyone is not going to be doing a ride share. So who are we building for? And so I think that with the fact that we have so many people in so many different spaces and with so many different experiences, it makes it hard. But that's why these kinds of conversations and spaces like this are important for us to begin the dialogue. And so that is the work, that the conversations that we've been having around different other issues, around the importance of dialogue. Because first, one, we got to build relationships with each other, right, in our communities. And we have to have even under like a level of understanding. So Dr. Brandy talked a lot about the fact that, you know, there were so many different opinions in terms of the mural. And I had even friends that I grew up with that said, like, we knew that it was coming down. Like, that's, you know, why are you upset? Like, you shouldn't be upset, or you should be, and if you are upset, you should be participating. And so these are different perspectives. And so I think that one thing that where we are now is that we need to go back to that village, right? That village mentality. And we need to have not only hard conversations with those that are trying to come into our community, but we need to have them with ourselves and with each other, right? And come up with different ways that we can bring our own individual experiences and perspectives together, so that we can come up with a unified message and unified asks and strategies.
Marisa, thank you. We're going to go to Dr. Brandy, and the reason why well, first of all, DeeDee's Cry is founded by, of course, a horrific experience, but Toy's taken that and really moved us into a space of being intentional about our mental health. And just a few hours ago, Black Mental Health Awareness Month finished. It was the month of July. And so Marisa's named some heavy stuff. Miranda's has named some heavy stuff. And Dr. Brandy, though you are a migrant, you've stepped right in. Your operations for Roxbury Parade, you understand village, period. And gentrification is not just subject to one particular city or state. So if you could and I will be sensitive to time factors and name that our Dr. Rushing and our Representative Miranda, who's been doing a lot of current fighting down at the place that Dr. Rushing talked about called Beacon Hill, with some others, they do have to step out. So I will need to start moving folks up as far as speaking in time. But after Dr. Brandy, I would like to go back to Dr. Rushing and just hear from him, from your perspective, what it is that we need to be doing today as a people to ensure that the historical value and all that Roxbury has bought and produced and will produce stays intact, despite the colonizers. Dr. Brandy.
Okay, that was a lot. So I guess one thing that I heard Representative Miranda say and Marisa say is, there's a quote that I love that Elizabeth Warren was quoted as saying, I think it was like in Times Magazine or something, but she said that if you aren't at the table, you're likely to be on the menu, right? And so if your voice isn't in that room or in those spaces when these conversations are being had about developments with regards to community, or about which grocery stores should be placed where, or which parking should be metered versus street, and all these other conversations, then unfortunately your voice is muted oftentimes, or you're like a lamb to slaughter. And so one thing that I think about when we talk about gentrification, when we talk about, again, a lot of the micro and macro levels of things going on, is that, again, with this idea of change and with this idea of community, this having a connection to community is important to one's mental health, physical health, financial, and a lot of other aspects. And in a sense, this loss of community can impact one's, risk in terms of depression, in terms of, other things that go on in terms of negative incidents. But the one thing I think was highlighted by Marisa is this idea that it does take a village, but what do you do when you look around and you don't see the village anymore? You literally do not see a reflection of what you see to or mean to be a village. And so how do you cope with that? How do you deal with that while everything else is going on? Because again, we have this development continuing in the midst of a pandemic. You have all these other things still continuing. So how do we deal? How do we cope? And how do we come back together despite everything that is going on? And that is something that definitely needs to be talked about, definitely needs to be addressed, and something we need to elevate. Because again, and I'll repeat it because I just love it so much, as Elizabeth Warren said, if you ain't at the table, you own the menu. And so how do we as a community, collectively, individually, come to that table, whatever the table is, whether it's education and thinking about our kids going back to school this fall and how to do that safely, or whether it's thinking about these developments that are coming up. I live in the Fort Hill area, and there has been so many changes in the last 2 years, let alone decades.
Indeed.
And so how do we do this?
Dr. In a whole lot, and the mental health aspect is huge. And I think one of the things that when we move into spaces that when people are frustrated and aggravated, sometimes there is a way to shift sort of that energy into sort of action. So Dr. Rushing, if you could sort of help us from, again, you're giving the historical context. If you could sort of begin to bring us into a conversation about, there's been a lot of activism. There's been a lot of protests going on. And all of us have talked about this sort of in different spaces about intergenerational and the switch and sort of how advocacy was done when you first got here and mentioned versus some ways things are being done now. So in the context of Roxbury and what it is we need to do and stay engaged, can you sort of give us, I won't say closing remarks, we know you do have to leave out early, but if you could leave us, what is the message you want to leave all of us with, but specifically Roxbury residents around what's the next steps? How do we ensure things like this don't happen again? Stay informed and participate.
Well, I think the answer to that, of course, is the answer that was given by Marcus Garvey, which is organize, organize, organize. And I think I have just absolute, almost unadulterated praise for everyone that's out in the street. I think that what we are seeing right now here in New England and then obviously throughout the country and in parts of the world is a decision to express a unity for significant structural change. It is related especially to ending racism, but it goes beyond that. And that is what is so important. But in doing that, I think it's essential that people have a sense of history. For me, history is really memory. It is our corporate memory. It is not our personal memory. It is our personal memory plus. It is our personal memory, including the memory of everyone that we can talk to in our family, in our neighborhood, and then everything that we can read about the places that are most important to us. And because the memory there is an opposite to memory. And we all know what that is. And when you don't have memory, if you can't remember, we call that amnesia. And we have to overcome the corporate amnesia in our community. And when you have amnesia, you cannot figure out, you don't have the information to tell you how to make decisions about the future. And if there is any mental health condition that comes to mind over and over to me during these times is amnesia. That part of what we are doing out in the street in our study, in our conversations, is to overcome our amnesia so that we have the knowledge to know where we are right now to make decisions about where we go in the future.
Dr. Rushing, thank you so much. And it's a good segue into, and I keep saying Representative Miranda because she's a friend. I want to respect her, but Liz, with all due respect, is here. Is just a Roxbury girl tonight, chilling. But I just want to honor that because it is an achievement, you know what I mean, of what you're doing and what you did. So I just want to be real about that. You're here as a resident and as a Roxbury girl who has achieved. And so if you could pick up where Dr. Rushing left off about the amnesia, you talked a few minutes ago about a couple of things that you know that have disappeared from the area. You have also been very transparent about, you know, loss in Roxbury and whatnot. What is it, Liz, that you see based on what Dr. Rushing said about not so much not forgetting, but if you could talk about remembering history, and then how do we continue sort of that move? And I think Marissa's going to have some points on it in a more minute sort of direct grassroots level, but if you could sort of talk about how we take the success of Chuck, Byron, Doris, all of them, and stand on their shoulders with the understanding of the energy of our youth and 21st century advocacy.
So one of the important things is, like, now that I'm in the State House, you know, so much of what I learned about the history of Roxbury, and so much of what I even learned about the history of the building that I walk into, well, pre-COVID, almost every day, where there's only 2 buses of African-American people I can see, and there are 2 African-American abolitionists. Thank you, Dr. Rushing, for telling me about Sarah Redmond, and I also knew about Josephine St. Ruffin. One of the things that's been used in our country since its founding is this erasure of culture and memory and history for African-American people. This afternoon, I just watched Beyonce's Black is King. I'm not a Beyonce stan, so this is really weird for me. But one of the things it did inspire for me was this idea of reminding ourselves that we come from kings, we come from Timbuktu, we come from royalty. And what we see in our society is this sort of sense of nothingness, and that we're at the bottom of every totem pole. We're the most policed, most incarcerated, most under-resourced communities. Yet we've been so resilient and we've survived so much to get to this point. And so for me, I really see us moving into this next stage with 3 pieces. I've also been very transparent about my struggle being an elected official coming from activism. Marisa and I both have membership in a club no one would want to have, which is that we both lost our brothers to gun violence. And we have consistently suffered compounded traumas that, even though we've achieved and done great things and continue to do great things, these are things that do not leave you. You know, these are things that are part of your memory personally. And when we walk in our communities, when we visit our family members, when we talk to our siblings, friends, all of these things are triggering. And when you talk about change, the change, because it happens so frequently and we're so misinformed sometimes, that it also is triggering. And I think what we saw online was that people were crying out, not only because they saw something coming down, but they've been faced with gentrification, with this trauma, with not being able to afford to live in a community you love or buy a home, losing their grandparents, having COVID. Like, we could go through a list for 20 minutes long of all the things that we endure in our communities. And then when we see something that we love, we're pushed to a place. And now the Roxbury Love Murals isn't even my district. And so I don't want to talk about the semantics of it, but I will talk about that I believe that we are headed to another renaissance. I have been so inspired by the street movements, by our young people saying no more, because sometimes you get tired and sometimes you feel like, you know, you're doing whatever you can with what little you have, and you're in your own lane and you don't know how to cross over into another lane to talk about something that we need to be saying out loud. We need to be saying out loud that the reason why people are not participating is they're working 2 or 3 jobs or night shifts. 65% of Roxbury households are female head of households. Mama's got 3 kids, she ain't got the time. It's not in different languages. So if you don't speak English, which many of our Roxbarians, whether they're speaking Somali, Cape Verdean Creole, or Spanish or other languages, don't feel like they can participate. And so there's this never-ending marathon that we're on. For example, there's so many projects in Roxbury. The other night, 2 weeks ago, I had 4 development meetings in one night. Now, I'm a resourced person. I know when these things are happening. I'm an elected official that gets these emails. But for a regular Roxbury resident, they may not be in tune with what's happening with them. So I think, one, we need to start doing a massive healing. And I don't know which intervention or if we need a dozen interventions, but I made a joke, but it wasn't a joke about saging the whole Roxbury, but there's this idea that we're hurting and we need to take time to rest, to take time to heal ourselves, to deal with the demons that we're dealing with, and figure out how we can actually show up in spaces stronger. The second, Byron mentioned this, community organizing work has really been stifled by social media. And although social media is really great for making things viral and sharing a message, the people-to-people movement that many of us learned, those strategies of calling on your neighbor or just checking in on people or making sure you put a flyer in someone's door instead of just relying on someone to find out when a Zoom link is happening. I think we need to go back to that. So Andrea Campbell had a resident leadership institute, but I would love to go back to creating more of that each month, having opportunities for young people and elders to learn how to use social media to organize, how to talk to your neighbor, what issues are happening on your block that you can take care of. And lastly, is something that I speak a lot to James about. It's been really hard to be an elected official and see the disunification of our people. I grew up, in the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative where, we didn't always agree on the movement, but we took one thing at a time and worked together. And behind closed doors, you might have said, hey, Miss Jenkins, I didn't like the way you talked to me. Or, hey, Mr. Jones, I think you need to make more room for young people. We are seeing a system right now where there's a lot of division among leadership. And so for people who are just regular everyday residents, it's really hard for them to self-realize their own power because they're seeing us. And I'm not saying we need to be best friends here, but they're seeing us be at odds so much that people just don't have the bandwidth to step into their own power because they're seeing sort of this muck of activists and electeds and other community leaders really saying, no, it's this issue, no, it's this issue, no, it's this issue, and we're going to do it this way, we're going to do it this way, we're going to do it this way.
We need to do it this way, yes.
Yeah, people really want us to sort of set out a plan or give them room to give their ideas on, how do we actually combat gentrification? And I will say this to end, that I just recently wrote a bill on police accountability. It was the most aggressive bill because I know what it's like to visit a brother, 2, 3 brothers and a father in jail. I know what it's like to have a gun pointed at me. I know what it's like to have an officer tell me to shut up and sit down and mind my business. And although I still give a lot of respect to the officers who go day in to give back, like Officer Baxter and Officer Grubbs, who I remember at the we need to give them their love. What I found was that the police unions were able to organize and out-organize us in a way that I was really shocked by, because I thought we were a people that could really organize and mobilize and fight for our rights in a way that could really be more vocal. But again, we were out-organized. And right now, we don't know where this bill is coming out of conference committee, but it'll be much weaker than I presented it. And still we'll have to take something, because I don't know another time where Black electeds will be given this much power to make something happen. But investing in teaching organizing is, I think, the way to go. And if we do that by teaching people how to join a civic association, how to send an email, how to make a phone call, how to show up, I don't think we'll be seeing the same fights. And we really need each other. And I just want to say thank you all for inviting me today. I will continue on with these conversations if I'm invited again. I think there's more people to be invited, because I think people in Roxbury, if there's one thing about us, we love to talk about our community. We love to be seen and to be heard. And we love to be included in its future. So thank you all and have a good night.
Thank you so
Liz.
much. And I know she does have to pop off. And someone said, wait, was it you, Toy?
No, I did. Yes, because you didn't mention Project Crenshaw.
So I created a digital platform called Project Crenshaw 617 on Instagram with a company called IDEO, because when I first got into my role, I just saw so much anxiety and depression and trauma in my community. And I was also struggling with that in my own life. And you can go to Instagram and follow it. There's a board of directors that we've taken from the community, of people who are providers, mental health providers, or they're just residents of the community. And what I'm hoping to do, when the rapper Nipsey Hussle was murdered, I had a reaction like my own brother. And I just, was in a room and I said to myself, you don't even know this guy. You listen to his music, but what about his death is really triggering you and transforming you? And it was a line that I heard from a movie about when crack hit us, there was no therapy for us, that I heard someone say, that I was like, wait a minute, the reason why I'm having this reaction is I've never gotten help. I've never sought out professional resources at that time for my own sort of, cognitive memory of the losses and the trauma that I faced since childhood. And it wasn't just my brother's death. It wasn't just Nipsey Hussle's death, but it was my best friend at 18 who passed away, who was killed on Copeland. And so Project Crenshaw, I hope, is a place where I can share digitally, because people can only seek help when they're ready. And I just want to make sure that there's a platform that we can improve the access to competent and culturally competent care. That's really important. If I walk into a room and a doctor is not of the same mindset, they might be performing racism and structural racism on me and microaggressions. They don't even know they're doing it, because they don't understand what it's like to really be us. And so I want to thank Dr. Brandy and DeeDee's Cry and Robin. I've seen you on a bunch of these events, that every time you're doing your Facebook Lives, it is changing someone's life. It's giving someone hope. And that's what I'm hoping to do, is that we can increase hope, provide better resources, and increase access to mental health. Because what we're doing is we're spewing our pain on Facebook when we can do that. But if we really want to get results, we want to be able to spew our pain, get help, and be able to act. And if we can keep doing that, I think we'll be more successful. So thank you for reminding me about Project Crenshaw. And thank you. It's been an honor talking to you all.
Liz, hold on before you go. Just all that what you said and whatnot. We need to book you on a weekday morning at 9 o'clock and come talk more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, session is over, so I got time.
All right. Liz has to go. So we want to say thank you so much. And then we want to talk to Marisa a little bit. And Marisa, I'm sitting there like pointing at you, like people can see who I'm pointing at on my screen, but it's just interesting to hear affirmation of some spaces and some things that you've talked about. We are a little bit over time, but Marisa, if you could, I always wind up coming to Marisa, putting stuff on her. I love you. If you could sort of like, she talked about, Liz talked about organizing. You and I in some different spaces have been talking about getting back to sort of the neighbor to neighbor, the village that Dr. Brandy referred to and a couple of others. So if you could bring it home to sort of that grassroots level based on what Dr. Rushing said, based on what Liz said, if you could bring it to sort of the rap approach And you know what that is based on what we've been talking about. Did we lose? Okay.
Yes. No, I'm here. So in terms of, I just felt everything that State Representative Miranda said completely resonated with me, especially around just talking about this compounding trauma. And so when we are experiencing in our community all of this loss that happens on a daily basis, it's not just these murals coming down and these buildings coming down, it's the disregard, even just trash in our community, right? Just in terms of the amount of noise that we have to encounter, fireworks. I mean, the list goes on and on and on, and all of that has a compounding effect on one's psyche, right? It means that it sometimes makes you feel like you don't matter, and or our communities don't matter. And so I think that it is important for us to reclaim our communities, right? Get back to the village, right? Really get back to building the village and sustaining the village. And for me, I think that really begins with getting more neighborly. I mean, I used to work for an organization I founded, SCI Dorchester, years ago. And this is around the time that you and I met, James. And our focus was really around increasing civic engagement, building social capital, and increasing civic engagement. And the fact that, you know, we've now shifted from people are not even comfortable if you run out of sugar. You know, you're not comfortable enough to go knock on your neighbor's door and ask for some sugar because you don't even know your neighbor. And so I think that it's important for us to start really thinking about how do we break down these walls or those barriers to connecting with one another, because it first has to start there before we can even begin to, because there's a privileged space that even those of us that are on this panel, those of us that are doing the work that we operate in, right? That we have a certain level of access that a lot of people don't have. And for the reasons that state representatives spoke about, is that people have to work, they're working. And then they're trying to raise families. And so it's very hard for people to try to get engaged on, attend meetings and all of that. And so we have to get creative. So that means that we have to start to connect one-on-one with each other and build that relationship and share information and be open to sharing information with people, right? Also in terms of, you know, starting people, you know, really, you know, starting neighborhood blocks and like on their streets, and just to kind of build rapport with their neighbors street by street. And the other key thing that I wanted to really share here, and Dr. Brandy mentioned this with the quote that Senator Warren shared, but we have to begin to make room, you know, at the table, right? Like not only just, you know, you have to make sure that you try to force your way to the table, but we also have to create room for younger people. And because there's a lot of younger people who want to engage in, be civically engaged and engaged around politics, but we're not making room for them. Right. And we're doing the same. And I say we're doing the same old status quo. And it's not what we need right now. We need to push the pendulum. And so we got to make room for these young people. Because that is where the shift is really, truly going to begin. And also, last thing is around, we have a saging event happening, and it's going to next Saturday, and it's going to be from 6 to maybe 10 p.m. where we're going to sage the Roxbury community. So we're inviting everyone to come out. It's called Sage Boston. So please check it out on social media.
Turn your mic on. Turn your mic on.
See, the CEO done moved into digital director.
That
But
was me
we,
Yeah, I
last
thought
week.
it was just me. So
no, you're
That
good.
was me last week talking with my mic on mute.
Toy, thank you. You turned the digital director tonight. But what I wanted to do, we are getting ready to wrap up, and there was a lot to unpack tonight. And though DeeDee's Cry has a mental health focus, and mental health was a huge theme of tonight, we've delved into the spaces of organizing and also mental health and gentrification and whatnot. So there was a lot to unpack. And Dr. Brandy, again, I always come up with these last minute things and asking folks to do miracles. If you can somehow surmise and give from a clinical perspective advice, Marisa talked about the next steps in organizing. And if you could talk about the next steps in sort of guarding our psyche and our spirit, because we did take on a lot tonight. I think this conversation is going to cause people to be more cognizant of things in their neighborhood. And then with that, I have the saying that awareness is bliss and awareness is stressful is something I wouldn't say on DeeDee's Cry right now. But if you could, within a couple of minutes, give us a synopsis from a clinical perspective, and then I'll turn it back over to Robin and Toy. Marisa, I just, as a guest remaining, as a this occurrence family member, thank you so much. And just though they're not here, Representative Liz Miranda, and then also Byron Rushing as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things is that a lot was discussed, whether historical to present day to, you know, kind of the future and our ideals and hope for the generations coming behind us. And I think when it comes to mental health, one of the things that Marisa just highlighted is that, and Representative Miranda, is that we do need space and time as a community to heal from the traumas and to be able to discuss those traumas, to be able to unpack those traumas, because sometimes if you aren't able to have those discussions, it's hard to think about organizing. It's hard to think about everything else when you are still in pain from violence that occurred or from your family being impacted by COVID, and you don't see the help that they're talking about on CNN, you know, and so, or you continually every single day go down Melnia Cass and see individuals struggling, you know, and so I think there has to be and to need to be these conversations around how do we heal first and foremost. And then the second piece of that conversation, as Marisa said, is what supports are necessary for the healing, the activism to happen in the same realm without one suffering, right? And so you got to heal, you got to find hope, but to heal and find hope, I need to have babysitters in order to attend these meetings and do the activism. I need to have jobs in my community. I need to have, you know, if we're talking about health, I need to have access to walkable paths and those types of things in order to then think about, so I can get healthy, so then I can attend a meeting and bring my full self and be my full self in these spaces. And so I think one of the things that we are hearing today is that DeeDee's Cry, and you know, I know the work Marisa's doing, Representative Miranda, we're going to continue to have these conversations, continue to advocate, and anyone listening, we encourage you to continue to advocate, to continue to, again, start that process of healing, really continue these conversations, how we do it. Because, you know, as James Baldwin said, he said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. I'll say that again.
Say it
Not
again.
everything, I'll say it again. Not everything that is changed, that is faced, can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And so as a community, we need to face those things that have been harmful to us and that have hurt us and that have traumatized us. And then we also need to put on our hats and say, okay, how can we change that? How can we create space for us as tables where the changes are being talked about, discussed about, written about, spoken about? And so I'll end there, and I'll just say, again, I thank all the panelists. You know, Dr. Rushing had to leave early, Representative Miranda, but their comments were very illuminating, and I hope everyone gained something from everyone who spoke this evening. Continue to support DeeDee's Cry. We have other events coming up. You know, we're going to keep doing this, continue to support us. You know, as Marisa said, there's a saging event next week. Let's start there. Let's start there with the healing. Let's start there with continuing these conversations. And, you know, continue to support James with Java with Jimmy, Robin and some of the work she's doing. Let's continue, again, in our individual spaces and collectively to be the change we want to see, and to continue this healing and continue to finding hope and helping support our communities. That's it, James. That's all I
Okay,
got.
Robin, we're going to give it, Brad, you had a little signal, so we want to make sure we got everything there. I'm going to turn this back over to Robin, who is our host this evening. It has been a pleasure. Again, James Hills from Java with Jimmy, and also digital director for DeeDee's Cry. It's been a pleasure to have this beginning of much needed conversations. There was a panel earlier with some of our Black Boston delegation, and some of the same sentiment, Marisa, that was shared here today about the village and organizing was stated there as well. So Robin, I'm turning it back over to you. And Toy, it's been a pleasure this evening. Thank you all for joining in. Please now, Robin, show's back in your hands.
Thank you, James. And thank you everyone for the conversation tonight. Thank you all those out in Facebook Live in the audience listening and participating on the chat. Sorry that we didn't get a chance to ask the questions of the guests. They had to run for other appointments. There were just a few questions, not really too many. Somebody had asked, are there murals in other parts of the city like Alston? Again, I'm not sure. We're talking about Roxbury tonight, but you know, gentrification happens everywhere throughout the city of Boston. We are just focusing on Roxbury this evening. But part of what we heard tonight is definitely about bringing up the conversations so that we can collectively find a solution, whether it's with mental health issues or just social issues. It's all interconnected. So tonight we want to thank our sponsors, the Louis D. Brown Peace Institute, also Java with Jimmy. Thank Callaway Graphics for the flyer, and also the Roxbury Unity Day Parade. Also, you out there watching are our sponsors, whether you would like to give a donation or a gift of any amount, that would be appreciated. You can make your checks payable to the Louis D. Brown Peace Institute as our fiscal sponsor. And in the memo line, just put DeeDee's Cry. You can mail it to 2 John Elliott Square, number 2C, Roxbury, Mass. 02119. And there's also a GoFundMe page for DeeDee's Cry. Toy, did you have any last comments?
No, I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight, and everybody that tuned in. Really appreciate it. Love the conversation. I love Roxbury. Just support Java with Jimmy, Marisa with what she's doing, Brandy, Robin. Thank you guys. Yeah, and like DeeDee's Cry on Facebook, and we have a website. Thank you, Brandy, for that. So check out deedescry.com, and we have a YouTube channel. So the YouTube channel just called DeeDee's Cry. So check out the YouTube channel, DeeDee's Cry. Past videos are there. You can view them there, and look forward to what we're going to be doing. We have a couple events already scheduled for August, September, and October. So look forward to that. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Everyone have a good evening. Thank you all.
Have a good evening, everyone.